1. John chapter 1, and this morning I'm going to read verses 1 through 5. John 1, 1 through 5. This is what God says to us today. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. Let's pray together. Dear Father, in these moments as we come to your word, we do pray for the work of your Spirit in our hearts. We thank you for the light of the gospel. We thank you for our Lord Jesus Christ that has come into the world. And we do pray that we might see him more clearly, that we might worship him rightly today as you help us, your people. We pray this in his name. Amen. I'm very excited about our study through the Gospel of John, and my prayer is that as we go through this book over the next several weeks and months and years, I don't know how long it'll take, but I just pray that there will be much fruit from our study of this gospel, and it'll be a great benefit to the body. As I was thinking about the verses that I read this morning, my mind went back to an experience I had a couple of years ago when I was working at FedEx. My supervisor was a man from Lebanon. He was about my age. He had come to the States when he was a teenager, 16 or 17. He had been here for several years. He was still Muslim, and I had many opportunities to share the gospel with him. And a friend of mine at church heard that I had been sharing with him, and my boss still mostly read in Arabic. That was his comfortable language. He could speak English very well and could read in English. But his native language was Arabic, and so he was able to find a New Testament in Arabic and asked if I wanted to give it to him. I said, yes, I would love to. And so I took this New Testament up to my boss one night before work started, and of course now Muslims are very accommodating to the Bible. And so he was happy to have it, and I said, I would just love to know that you're going to commit yourself to reading this. And now I opened it, and if you've ever seen Arabic, some languages it's just, chicken scratch. And I assumed that it was Arabic. I couldn't read a word in it. And so I said, just to confirm, Bill, will you, he had a crazy name, but he changed it to Bill so everybody could pronounce it. So I said, Bill, will you just turn to John's Gospel and read those first few verses for me, just to make sure that you can read it? And so he opened it and he said, oh, yes, this is Arabic. I understand it. And he began to read to me out loud. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And I just began to tremble. My eyes welled up as Bill read those words, and he continued, in him was life, and the life was the light of men. There in his somewhat still Mideastern accent. And I just prayed, oh God, please let these words come to mean something to him. Let him come to know you as he reads this word. I hope that for those of us who have probably read the first few verses of John's Gospel many, many times, that it has not become just a mundane thing for us, but that we can still sense the magnitude and the profundity of these words. There's nothing quite like this in Scripture. John's prologue is just so majestic and so glorious, and I hope that we can still see this, even those of us who have read it many, many times. Over the next few weeks, we're going to just take the prologue and work our way through it. And my prayer is, Lord willing, that as we do so, you will be able to see what John is trying to point out for us. And today, the theme that I believe in these first few verses that rings through, to me at least, is this theme of new creation. New creation. How does John want us to see this idea of new creation in the first few verses? Well, let's begin to take a look at them, and hopefully we can see this. Introductions are very important, aren't they? Whether it's a book, a movie, or unfortunately a sermon, introductions are important because that's just that little tidbit at the beginning that has to get everybody's attention. All right? Many of us have probably picked up books or maybe articles. You've glanced at the first few lines and it just didn't really get you, and you've just set it aside and said, nah. Well, all the great works of literature, even the great movies, whatever it is, something that is of a narrative structure has to have a good introduction to get you, right? Has to get your attention. You have to look at that and say, well, this is interesting or intriguing. I want more. And I want to challenge you. Where in anything, any work of literature, can you find any introduction like John's Gospel? I don't know that there's anything like this. Not Shakespeare, not Wordsworth, Dickens, whoever your favorite writer, novelist, poet may be. Nothing can approach the magnitude of John's prologue. And of course, we, I think, would all agree to the Spirit's aid in helping John to write this, right? Of course we would, and surely that contributes to the beauty of it. Let's try to put ourselves, if we can, in John's time. Let's think back to the first century. This book is written anonymously. It doesn't say at the beginning, like Paul's letters, this gospel or this account is written by the Apostle John. I think, can assume correctly that it is the disciple and the Apostle John. The person who wrote this account refers to himself throughout this work as the one who Jesus loved, the disciple whom Jesus loved. And this is John the disciple, the son of Zebedee and brother of James, the one who Jesus loved. Isn't that a great way to describe yourself? I hope that you, as a follower of Christ, recognize that that is true of you as well. We are followers of Jesus, ones that he loves. There is a good bit of debate about the time of this story, this biography that John has written about Jesus. Everything seems to kind of hinge on AD 70, the year of Jerusalem's fall and destruction. And there are some who believe that John wrote before that. There are some who believe that John possibly wrote after that. And so the scholars debate that. The ones who say that John wrote before conclude that because John does not mention in his account anywhere the fall of Jerusalem and the destruction that came, and the destruction of the temple and the walls and the barbarous killings of thousands upon thousands. He doesn't mention that anywhere in his gospel. And I would say, okay, well, I think it's very possible that he may have written beforehand, but we also want to recognize that John, at the time of this writing, all the evidence seems to suggest that he is in the city of Ephesus, far removed from Jerusalem. Okay, Ephesus was a city that is located on what we call modern-day Turkey, eastern Turkey, right on the Mediterranean Sea. That's where the Apostle John was serving as a pastor. And so it could be that if he did write this account after AD 70, that John is simply pointing out that all of those things that were so important to the Jews don't matter anymore because Jesus has come, right? Jesus has come. Jesus, remember, is the one who is walking by and says, destroy this temple and I'll rebuild it. Okay? Jesus is the one who goes to the feasts and pronounces himself as the fulfillment of those things, right? And so there's really no way that we can know for sure when John wrote his account, but clearly he sees Christ as a fulfillment, as a replacement of all those types and shadows of things that would have been so important to the Jews. So John is here in Ephesus, compelled to write this account of which he was an eyewitness. Did he have any of the other gospel accounts as sources? That's another thing that is debated by the scholars. John is able to write the things that he writes, and he knows about these things because he had Matthew's gospel or Mark's gospel or Luke's or maybe portions of all three. Well, I don't know that he did or did not. He may have, and it may have helped him. He may not have. Remember, he's writing as an eyewitness. He's not writing a second-hand account. Luke in his gospel talks about gathering resources, talking to people, getting interviews. All right? Probably his, help was talking with some of the apostles. Luke was an associate of Paul who knew all of the apostles probably. Well, John was there. He saw it all. Over and over, he refers to how important it is that he is bearing witness. He is an eyewitness, okay? If you have something going on in court today, the strongest evidence that you can have is someone who was there who saw it, right? How do you know this happened? I was there. I saw it. Describe it. Da-da-da-da-da. That's exactly what John is doing. So he sits down to write his version of the story of the gospel. And we have read the last couple of weeks his purpose statement, right? I've written these things so that you might believe. Who is the you there? Well, this is another, in my opinion, pointless debate among the scholars and commentators. They say that John is an evangelist and he's writing to those who are lost, who don't know about Jesus, who are in unbelief. And I would say, well, that's very true. I'm sure he is. I'm sure he is very concerned about those in his place and time who have not heard the good news of Jesus. But I think he's also writing pastorally. We who know and have come to believe need to continue to believe this, don't we? We need to continue to believe. This is what Jesus says in John 3:36. Whoever believes in the Son has eternal life. Whoever does not obey the Son shall not see life, but the wrath of God remains on him. Do you notice there how Jesus equates believing and obeying? That's something, isn't it? To believe is to obey. And so I'm not convinced that John is writing exclusively to unbelievers. I think he's writing to everyone. That you is those who have not heard and those who have heard. Because we need this message too, don't we? We need to believe. We need to obey. We need to persevere in our faith in the gospel. And so the gospel is for all. How do you begin a story like this? You were for 3 years a follower of the greatest man who ever lived. And you want to write an account. You want to write an eyewitness account, a story about his life. How do you start something like that? How do you begin? Well, we don't expect to read what we find here at the beginning of John's Gospel, do we? Because of where it's placed in the New Testament, we've probably read Matthew and Mark and Luke, and we think about how they began their stories, right? Matthew does so with a genealogy. He wants to convince his readers that this Jesus is descended from David. He is the rightful king. He is the one who has the right to inherit David's throne. Luke also is very concerned about showing that this Jesus is a human being who has come in the flesh. And he gives us many details of Jesus' birth, right? The angel coming to this young lady, Mary, and the manger scene and so forth, and shepherds in the fields, and the glory of the Lord, and so on and so forth. We know Luke's story well, don't we? Well, John doesn't do that. Even the Gospel of Mark, over and over, we read that word immediately, right? Immediately. And so Mark starts his story with a prophecy from Isaiah talking about John the Baptist. And then so we are there in the wilderness at John's baptismal service, and Jesus shows up. And so immediately we are thrust into the ministry of Jesus Christ. John doesn't do anything like this, does he? No genealogy, no manger scene, no, I remember the day I met him and there he was being baptized. Not even that. It's amazing, really, how John has chosen to start his story, to introduce Jesus to us. We read his introduction, this what has been termed the prologue of his gospel, and we recognize, don't we, that there is something unique about this person, this one that John is introducing us to. So intriguing, so wonderful. We read these first few verses, and you can't help but want to read more. You can't help but want to know more. Who is this? Well, let's look at the first few verses and see what John is trying to show us about Jesus. This opening phrase is very familiar to us, isn't it? In the beginning. As soon as we see those words, our minds go back to the beginning, right? To Genesis 1:1. We read the exact same phrase, in the beginning. Now, we need to ask ourselves, why would John begin his account this way? Why does he do this? Just happenstance? Is he intentional? Well, I would submit to you that he is very intentional. The reason that John is borrowing these words from Genesis is for two reasons. The first, I think by using this phrase, he is drawing a parallel between the story that he is going to tell here in his gospel account and the account that we read about in Genesis, okay? I think this is going to be very clear to us as we move through. We see John using similar words and phrases from that account, don't we? We see him using words like light and life and darkness. If we look down at verse 10, I believe that there's even more evidence of this parallel to creation. The world was made through him. So there should be no doubt in our minds that John is wanting us to think that way, to think about creation, right? Using this language that he does. I think John is calling on us to recognize that there is a new creation taking place with the advent of this one that he is writing to us about. New creation. That's one aspect. But I would suggest that there's another. I think John uses this phrase from Genesis 1:1 to not only hint at the new creation with the coming of Jesus, but also to explain to us who Jesus really is. Specifically, his beginning. No genealogy, no birth scene. Where does John go to start his story? In the beginning. In the very beginning. And in doing so, really what he is telling us about this Jesus is that he had no beginning, right? That becomes very clear to us just in these first 5 verses, doesn't it? In the beginning was the Word. Now, we're going to spend a few minutes on this title that John ascribes to Jesus, the Word. But for now, I just want you to note that what he is saying is that this Jesus, the Word, was there in the beginning. Now, I recognize how difficult it may be for us to think about that, to comprehend the beginning. Okay? All of us have been moving around in time since we came into the world. Time had a starting point, didn't it? There was a point where there wasn't time. And when time began, that's the beginning. And John says, whenever that was, as best as you can understand that, Jesus was already there. He was there. He was there in the beginning. There was not a time when Jesus was not. He is the pre-existent one, the one who always is. Later, this becomes very clear to us as we work our way through this gospel. We will see that Jesus refers to himself as I am. Before Abraham was, I am. Okay? Pre-existent, self-existent, the one who has never not existed. This word translated here, beginning, is often translated as ruler. Now, we may not understand the equation there. Well, beginning is simply showing rank, okay? Status. Lots of times this word is translated ruler, and I would suggest that what John is communicating to us is that nothing comes before Jesus. Nothing outranks Jesus, not even time. Think about that. How great is it for someone to be there before time, to be over time, to not be limited by time? That's what John is trying to tell us. In fact, if you look down at verse 15, this is what John the Baptist says, right? He who comes after me ranks before me because he was before me. Now that'll blow your mind, right? Jesus was born after John the Baptist, but John says, no, he ranks before me because he was before me. John the Baptist, you. He didn't just come into existence. He has always existed. Paul says in Colossians 1:17, and by the way, Colossians chapter 1 is a wonderful parallel passage for John's prologue, but Paul says there, he, Jesus, is before all things, even time. Jesus is before all things. And before time was began, Jesus was there. That should get our attention, shouldn't it? That should make us want to read on and get more into this story. And so let's do that. And now we want to turn our attention to this all-important title that John has given to Jesus, the Word. I have to tell you, I was a little bit hesitant to go through John's Gospel just because I didn't want to tackle this this term that John uses here. I mean, I've been wrestling with this for a long, long time. What does it mean? What an unusual title for John to ascribe to Jesus. In the beginning was the Word. And he emphasizes it, doesn't it? Just in verse 1, 3 times. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So John wants us very clearly to understand that Jesus is the Word. What does that mean? What a strange title to ascribe to Jesus. Well, you probably know that this is from the Greek word logos. It's really a very common word. It is all throughout the Greek New Testament. It's all throughout the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, over and over again. So it's not as if John has found some special word or some mystical, mysterious word, and yet there is something mysterious about him using this word to describe Jesus, huh? And he doesn't just describe Jesus with this. He says this is what Jesus is. He is the Word. It's a common word, logos, used throughout the Scriptures. Jesus says in Matthew 7:24, whoever hears these words of mine, he uses logos. Whoever hears these words, logos of mine. He tells the disciples, if anyone will not hear your words, your logos, the plural form, shake the dust off your feet. So there really doesn't seem to be, in some sense, anything that stands out about this term, logos. Interesting, Luke chapter 3, verse 4, and this word is also used throughout the New Testament and many other places to refer to the Scriptures. Luke 3:4 says, as it is written in the book of the words, the logos of Isaiah the prophet. And so it can be used to refer to the Scriptures in the Old Testament, but not exclusively. I mean, it refers to speech, to words, to someone's statement. There's two words, actually, in Greek for word, logos and rhema. Interestingly, the word rhema is never used, though, to refer to the Old Testament Scriptures. I think that may be a hint for us to understand what John means and why he uses this word logos. The debate among scholars is that, well, John is taking something that his Jewish readers would have understood, this term and this concept of logos, because it comes up so often in Jewish scriptures, especially in the wisdom literature, in Proverbs, and in some of the apocryphal writings, the wisdom of Solomon. And when you see it in those places, it's paralleled there and often joined together with this idea of wisdom. And so there's a handful of scholars that say, oh yeah, what John is trying to say is that Jesus is wisdom. He is the wisdom. And others say, oh no, John, he's writing later in the first century. He's in Ephesus, mostly around Greek-speaking people, the Hellenists of his day. And so he's taken this Greek term, logos, that was a very important term to the philosophers of that time period. They tried to understand what this logos was, such an important concept to them. And the reason that it was so important because they recognized that it was powerful. And I'll just think back again to that time period where philosophy is so important and debate is so important. You remember Paul traveling through certain areas of his world, Athens in particular, and he's debating there with those philosophers. And they would come every day and just have debates and discussions. And it was so fundamental to them if you could convince someone of your point of view. And the way you would do that is not hold the sword over them, but just debate. Use your words. Use your speech. And so many would look at this and say, oh, well, that's what Paul or John is doing. He's using this term logos because the Greeks would have understood that, and it was such an important concept for them. I really don't know that it has to be an either-or case. I think John has taken a word here that was important to everyone and understood by everyone, whether it was Jews or Greeks or Christians, pagans. And he says, this, logos, that's what Jesus was. He was there in the beginning, and he is the Word. And I think the point is simply that Jesus is the expression, the perfect expression, the perfect revelation of God. That's what man needs. We need God, right? That's what has been broken in the garden, is fellowship with God. We've been banished, put away. How can that be restored? How can that be brought back? John says, with Jesus. He is the Word. He is there at creation. He is that perfect expression that God has communicated. Everything before Jesus was just a little bit short of what it needed to be, whether it was dreams or visions or prophets. But now the perfect manifestation of God has come. Words are so important. We cannot communicate without words, can we? I mean, we can, but think about how limited and how unusual it would be for us to try to communicate without words, without logos. Let's just say, if we can imagine this may be a little stretch for us, but let's imagine that I have come in this door today for the very first time. I'm a complete stranger to all of you. You don't know me. I don't know you. And I come in and I want to get to know George Plummer, but we can't speak. We can't exchange words. We can't communicate. Now, I want to get to know George. I'd like to know about him. What can I know without talking to him, without him talking to me? Well, I can guess his age, maybe his weight. George looks to be of European descent. I'm not going to find out very much about him, though, am I? I mean, just this. I don't know anything about it. Okay, he wears nice clothes. I'm really not getting anywhere. Can I know him? Can you know someone if they don't speak to you, if you don't speak to them? Now, let's remove the barrier and say, okay, George, we can talk now. Immediately, this is going to start doing that. And I'm going to start to know George Plummer. He's going to tell me about himself. He's going to tell me that this person sitting next to him is his wife. So I know he's married. He's been married to this person. He can tell me how long. For a long time. They have children. They have grandchildren. He lives in Collierville. He taught school. He loves science. And on and on and on and on and on and on. And George can tell me more and more about him, and I can get to know George. This is what Jesus has come to do. To man from God perfectly, completely. Just show us the Father, and that'll be enough for us, Philip says. What does Jesus reply? If you've seen me, you've seen the Father. Wow. Again, let us go back to creation. And when we go back to the Genesis account, Genesis 1, there is a recurring refrain over and over like the chorus of a song. And God said, and God said, and God said. And every time God says, something happens. Things come into being. Things come to life. This is who Jesus is. He is the Word. He is the expression of God. And who else could show us God but Jesus? No one. No one can show us God like Jesus can. Why? Because the second phrase there says that the Word was with God. Jesus, the Word, was with God. We could translate this more literally. The Word was at God's side. Because with means to be alongside of. Okay? Alongside of. You might say, well, what's the difference? You can just simply say with. I would encourage you to think about this. Jesus being there alongside of God. Stacy and I occasionally go shopping together. Kohl's or the grocery store or whatever. But we sometimes separate. I have things I want to see. She has things she wants to see. If somebody calls me and says, "Is Stacy with you?" What am I going to say? Yeah, she's with me. She's in the same general location. We're under the same roof or whatever. But she might not be beside me. And John is telling us that this word, Jesus, was with God. He was alongside God. In fact, if you look down at verse 18, the literal translation there is that he was in the Father's bosom. There is closeness. There's intimacy. There's union between the Word and God. And that's why he can show us who God is. That's why he is the Word, the perfect expression, the perfect revelation of God. But it's not just that he is the Word and he was with God and he was there in the beginning. But in case anyone has any doubts about what John is trying to say, he makes it very clear with his last phrase in verse 1, doesn't he? And the Word was God. There you have it. John, are you speaking of one who possesses divinity? A divine one? Yes, absolutely. Let there be no doubt that this Word was God. And I believe that that is one of his main goals here, one of his main intentions here in the very beginning of his gospel, and the introduction even to the prologue is to show that Jesus was God. It's as if he is saying that this one that he speaks of here, the Word, the perfect expression, the perfect communication from God, always existing, always with God, always at God's side, was God. And there it is, Jesus, the Word, was God, divine. I don't really want to take the time to get into the New World Translation debate and Jehovah's Witnesses. I'll just simply say to you that if you happen to come across them and you get tangled up in the debate, they do not maintain consistency throughout John's Gospel, okay? They change it up here, but then in subsequent places where they need to maintain their change, they don't. In John 1:1, they change it to the Word was a God, making Jesus less than deity. And folks, this is simply something that has been attempted from John's day until now. There are many who do not want to ascribe to Jesus the deity that he deserves, that he is. Whether we ascribe it to him or not, whether we recognize it or not, he is the Word that was God, always has been God. As such, he is to be believed. He is to be obeyed. He is to be worshipped. We see evidence of that in John's Gospel, don't we? Those who were healed, those who were touched by this man Jesus, worship him. Only God can be worshipped. Further evidence of his deity, I believe, is given in verse 3. All things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. There's no possible way for this one that John is teaching us about to be a creature, because he's the creator. He is the creator. Everything was made through him, and so any doubts that anyone has about the deity of Jesus should be laid to rest. A creature can't be a creator. He was created, but not Jesus. He is the creator. And let me call your attention to the fact that let's don't just read the first few verses of John's prologue as an apologetics lesson on the deity of Christ. It is that, but it's much more. This is the introduction to a story. And we recall last week that John is wanting to make a theological point. He wants to make several. And one is eschatological. So John is taking us back, yes, to the beginning, to see that Jesus was there, that all things were made through him, but he is also taking us forward. This is the introduction to a story. There's going to be much more. So he is the creator. All things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. I believe John is hinting to us here at the beginning, keep reading, keep reading. You're going to find out more about this creative work that the Word is going to do. Jesus was there at creation. And as the Word, it came about through him. But John is about to tell us of a new creation. And it begins with the arrival of Jesus. He signals a new day. I think the next verse points to this as well. Verse 4. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. Again, probably images from Genesis come to mind, don't they? God creates man and breathes into him the breath of life. God speaks. The very first thing that he creates is what? Light. And John says, in him was life, and the life was the light of men. Light comes from Jesus. Does he just mean literal light? Surely not. Is John trying to explain to us that it happened to be really dark there in Judea when Jesus showed up, and then when he got there, all of a sudden it was bright? Not in a literal sense, but in a figurative sense, yes, right? Because he goes on and says that this light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. What darkness? Again, literal darkness? No. Why would John say that the coming of Jesus is light coming into the darkness? How can there be darkness? Every day the sun shines. It's bright. Well, he must be referring to the darkness of sin. The fallen state that the world was plunged into by Adam and his disobedience and his banishment from the presence of God, from the light. All of a sudden there's darkness. I think verse 9 suggests that the coming of Jesus is to enlighten things because of the darkness of sin. The true light, which enlightens everyone, was coming into the world. How can there be light? Through Jesus. Only through Jesus. I would suggest to you that what John is trying to help us see and understand here is that there is a contrast between the first Adam and Jesus, who is coming into the world. The first man, he's made in the image of God, right? Out of all creation, only man is made in the image of God. Let us make man in our image, God says. And so that image, that reflection of the glory of God that Adam is supposed to disperse throughout the earth as he is filling the earth, he doesn't do. He fails to do. It's been tarnished because of sin. Because of sin, he's been banished from God, and he can never rightly reflect God's image in creation. But Jesus can. And he has come. Jesus, over and over throughout John's gospel, will refer to himself as what? Son of man. Son of Adam in Hebrew. So I do suggest, yes, there is a parallel here, because there is one now who has come, who is the exact representation of God, Hebrews 1 tells us. The exact imprint of his nature, the radiance of his glory. Paul again in Colossians 1:15 says he is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. So I suggest that we do see this as a new creation account, a new beginning with the coming of the Word, the light, the life, the Word that was made flesh to come and live among us men. John gives us this word that is so encouraging. It's such an important hint at the beginning of his story. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. When we read through John's story, brothers and sisters, it's going to appear that the darkness overcomes it. As Jesus surrenders himself up and is hanging on a cross, and his life is poured out. If the story stopped right there, we would say, no, John, you were wrong. The darkness has overcome. The light has been snuffed out. But that's not what happens. Jesus conquers death. And even though it appears that the light is so dim, it's never snuffed out. He emerges from the grave, and that life is given to us. That light that is being spread through the world today as the gospel is being proclaimed, that light is overcoming the darkness. The darkness cannot overcome it. What an incredible story. What an incredible beginning. I hope that your appetite has been whetted by the beginning of this story. It's like one writer says, it's like the overture of an opera. You hear it. You say, oh, that's fantastic. Give me more. I want to hear more of this story. And we do want to hear more, don't we? And we will hear more, Lord willing, in the days ahead. And we will see this Jesus, radiant, glorifying God, even in his death, his hour, that he comes and does for us. And it's very, very hard to believe. But that one that died rose again. We can believe it because there is an eyewitness account here that tells us the story, who saw it all, and we can believe it because there are other eyewitness accounts, and they are so overwhelmed by the sight of Jesus after his resurrection that they recognize who he is. What does Thomas say? My Lord